Well, thank you very much for such a warm welcome. I remember very fondly being here last time, and really this audience is absolutely fantastic. So thank you again for your time, spending it, and putting together a series like this. I see that my boss, Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, in the summer of 2022 called our country is now more polarized than at any time since the Civil War. And really, it's been, I think, a catalyst for these public and political issues workshops. And so thank you all for your interest. And really, it's going to be amazing in terms of information as you lead up to the presidential election in November. When we think of foreign relations, it's often kind of something that goes to the side when we think of how people vote or their key interests. Usually, the decision for the presidency is very much driven by domestic issues. So that's in part what drives my title of my talk, because rarely is foreign policy the kind of key, the centerpiece to it. Rarely is it kind of the number one issue over which people will vote. And so that's the reasoning behind it. Key to the presidential election, or is it going to be a side issue again? And so as we get started, sometimes when we think about foreign relations, we think, there's a lot that's crazy in the world. It's really very, very challenging. And maybe this comes to mind. You get the famous meme of Elmo and just the world is on fire, and we think, there's just trouble left and right and everywhere we look. Sometimes we read it in the newspaper, we see it on the evening news, and in fairness to the news, that's how they report. They report what's happening. Oftentimes it isn't with the analysis. And so I'm partly to blame for this. I'm asked to give my opinion on the evening news a lot on different radios and television stations, and sometimes it does feel this way. But in a sense, the reality is that we're still hugely, hugely blessed here in the United States. Really, our location is unsurpassed compared to any other place on the planet. We're very, very blessed. And sometimes when I have students that come to me or members of the public, decrying this is happening in the United States or that's happening in the United States, the question is, well, with which country would you switch places? Where would you prefer to be on the globe? That's not to downplay any of the deep challenges in our politics, and there are many. You've had many different workshops, but there's a blessing in the United States. We have these two giant moats to our left and right, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It provides real defense for us. And two generally friendly neighbors. We can decry it here or there, but again, with whom would you switch places? Where would you put yourself on the map differently? We're very, very blessed, and that is the reality. We're in a great neighborhood. There's not a ton that happens here, and often we can focus domestically. It's one of the reasons why the presidential election hinges often around what's happening here on our shores rather than foreign relations. Similarly, economically, if we take the world economy as a ball, and you can see the graphic from 2019, the United States still stands out as the strongest economy on the planet by some distance. China has certainly grown. They've done a lot that's very, very well in China, but notice the gap to the third and fourth. Germany and Japan, their GDPs respectively are some close to 23 trillion less than ours annually. That really is remarkable what our domestic economy has done over time. If you look at another metric that is gross domestic product per capita, so kind of per person, we're seventh. And in an American crowd, not to be number one is something of a travesty. But if we look at the countries that are above us, it's typically really small countries, or ones that have a ton of oil wealth, or countries where Americans own a lot of the multinationals and they've done well there. Ireland is a great example. Switzerland to some degree. And so there's still just a massive, massive amount of wealth and a massive, a really excellent position in the world if we look at the geographic location. So that's the question that I'm posing today. What kind of impact are we going to see of foreign relations on this forthcoming presidential election? And so in the United States, virtually every presidential election centers, as it rightly should, around the economy and jobs. Because after all, if people aren't working, if the economy isn't doing well, it is a real challenge to a president. And when we think about bread and butter issues, even though I personally love foreign policy, I love foreign relations, if I lose my job, if I have some kind of struggle economically, that's number one. And so it leads to this kind of interesting component to our politics in the United States, that very few presidents, when they're first elected, are bona fide foreign policy experts. It's actually pretty rare. Most are elected based on their platforms, whether for the Democrats or the Republicans, and they end up growing with it. They end up learning an awful lot, but very, very few are bona fide foreign policy experts. The last one is probably George H.W. Bush, former CIA director. You can certainly say there are good elements on a resume, but it's rare that a president comes as a foreign policy specialist. Moreover, when we think about the space for foreign policy or foreign relations in the debates, there's usually half a debate that's put aside of the 3 presidential debates. It ends up being about a third in total. And so foreign policy ends up being this real side issue when it's discussed. And people tend to vote very, very heavily on the economy, jobs, and then just the position of a candidate on a range of issues. And so what will 2024 be like? Will it be a side issue like it normally is? Or will it be much, much more central? Because every now and then, there is an election, there is a circumstance in the world where a lot's happening, and Americans say, this is going to be central. We need to pick a president that can solve these issues internationally. Every now and then, it is a real turning point in our politics. For example, if we take 2 relatively recent elections, but bear in mind it's only 2 of many. If we go back to 2004, at least a significant centerpiece was when President George W. Bush won re-election. In some ways, that election was a referendum on the Iraq War. Clearly, there was a lot more to it, but it was probably the last election recently wherein foreign policy played such a major role. If we go back to 1980, when then Governor Reagan defeated President Carter, a big part of that was the hostage crisis in Iran. And really, it was a significant piece for then President Reagan to come to power and to become the president after winning against an incumbent, which is rare in US politics. Incumbency comes with a lot of power and a lot of built-in kind of momentum. If we look back at other elections, 1972, 1968, 1952, 1944, 1940, these are eras of war, and it's hard to get around foreign policy as a centerpiece, a key to the election when it's in a significant time of war that impacts a lot of different people. But if we think about all the election cycles not mentioned here, whether 2020 or 2016, 2012, 2008, 2000, 1996, 1992, you get the picture. It's not to say that foreign policy meant nothing, but it's to say it just didn't rise to this very important level. And often a presidential candidate doesn't need to be well-versed in foreign policy to get elected. Maybe he needs a very strong Secretary of State or a good vice presidential candidate to kind of give that gravitas. But it's rare that you have a bona fide expert. And like I said, the last one was probably George H.W. Bush. And if we think about what landed on his desk during his presidency, you think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, issues of nuclear weapons, unification of Germany, the Gulf War. That's a lot of foreign policy, not to mention the start of the Yugoslav conflicts. And so here you have a foreign policy expert who served as the director of the CIA, and he's got to figure out Yugoslavia. There was a time when President George H.W. Bush said, which side is which, and how do we kind of figure this out? There are so many ethnic groups and different religious groups. What does it all mean? How can we help in it? It was just that challenging and that complicated as well. And so if we look at 2020 as an example of the point I'm trying to make, you can see that foreign policy matters. When Americans vote, they have to say, yes, we need a good foreign policy brain, but we really need a leader, and these are a lot of the big issues. You can see foreign policy was ranked number 6. 57% of Americans, when asked, said, yes, this is very important to me and how I vote. So it is significant, but it does tend to be a side issue as compared to the big ones normally, the economy, healthcare. And so you can see others that kind of made 2020 a little different: Supreme Court appointments, COVID-19 outbreak, and then you can see a range of different issues that normally come up in our politics, important issues, but foreign policy being number 6, very different from the economy at number 1. And so when we approach the 2024 election, we're seeing with regularity the field being winnowed down. The former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, just dropped out yesterday. And we can see now that the Republican side is down to 4 candidates. I believe there's still a 5th one in there who has not dropped out, former Governor Asa Hutchinson, but he's polling very, very low at this stage. On the Democratic side, I still have Congressman Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson there, although it's very, very unlikely that either one will win the nomination, but we'll see. Strange things have happened in politics, but in all likelihood, as is the norm, the incumbent tends to get the nomination if it is sought. And so that's what I have on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you have the former president, Donald J. Trump, the former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, and an entrepreneur, Vivek Ramaswamy. And so these are the major candidates. And so it's worth taking a look at some foreign policy connections to them and what's said. And so I'll try and give a plus and a minus because I know these workshops are supposed to be nonpartisan, and I'll do my best in that. If I play my cards, I teach at Cedarville. It's a conservative Christian institution. Okay, so we'll lay that out there. But one of the joys of being an academic is we just, what is? Can I study something? And that's what I enjoy. And so if we look at President Biden, a lot of Democrats will say he's got this vast experience in the Senate. I mean, long term as a senator, and especially on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That makes him an expert, right? And the other big thing is he's visited over 140 countries. I mean, that really is quite remarkable when you look at it. But on the other side, the former national security advisor to both Presidents Bush and Obama, Robert Gates, said this of President Obama, that he's been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. That's a tough statement that's made about the sitting president. And so Democrats will make one argument, Republicans will make another, but this is a stinging one for President Biden, especially on that issue of foreign policy. This is a picture from last night. Maybe you watched the debate between Governor DeSantis and former Governor Haley, the fifth Republican debate. And interestingly, foreign policy featured very, very heavily in it. It was kind of an interesting one. I kind of went, hey, I'm giving this talk tomorrow on whether foreign policy will be key or a side issue, and maybe it's making the case that it will be a key component of this election. And so of the major Republican candidates, as with either side, those that support the former president, Donald J. Trump, as a businessman, with strong credentials there, doing business deals in a lot of different countries that gave him this gravitas. Plus, he served as president for 4 years. And when you serve as the president, you get to meet a lot of people. You travel a lot of places. Often presidents lament, hey, I've got to do all these foreign meetings. I can't get stuff done domestically. That was a complaint of Presidents Trump and Obama and Bush, and you can go back a ways with that. The modern presidency is very challenging with all the international commitments required. The Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, served in Iraq. He's often noted on the campaign trail that he is a foreign policy expert, that people should trust him with the presidency. Internationally, he actually gets more criticism than typically at home. People say, okay, you're a foreign policy expert. Tell us why. Give us some detail. Go into the information. He is the governor of Florida, and it is worth noting that he certainly is saying more and connecting more to things that are happening in Latin America. He's had 2 British equivalent of cabinet members over to Florida to sign deals recently. So there are all kinds of ways that he is trying to bolster this foreign policy connection. He went on a tour of a range of different countries, including the United Kingdom and Israel early on in his candidacy. And so he's trying to make this case that he is someone that can serve. The former South Carolina governor, Nikki Haley, was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a difficult position, a lot of different challenges on the campaign trail. She has made the case, hey, I've had to deal with China and Russia and North Korea and Iran regularly. You can trust me with this. On the flip side, on the con side, she's been critiqued on the grounds that she was UN ambassador for 18 months. She could have done it for a whole 4 years. Could have been a lot longer. She could have spent more time really gaining that credential. But what's interesting about this election, as we're moving into this cycle, is that regardless of where you stand on these candidates, probably more so than in recent memory, there's a lot of foreign policy experience and skill out there. Certainly there's room for critique, and that's the way that politics works, to make an argument, but there's a lot here. There are some serious candidates on both sides of the aisle. And so why is foreign policy important, or maybe particularly important in this cycle? Why are these candidates that have a stronger foreign policy resume rising to the fore? I mean, I think on the Republican side of, just a lot of very, very strong candidates, typically those with lesser foreign policy credentials have dropped out. They haven't really risen to challenge. And in a way, the world is shifting even in front of our eyes right now. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, it violated a long-standing international norm. That is, countries should not try to aggressively take on another country. They shouldn't try to annex another territory. This is something that was foundational from the end of World War II. It was a lesson of history that these types of aggressive behaviors shouldn't happen anymore. And now that Russia's violated it so significantly, I think in many ways and in the minds of many voters, foreign policy is rising as an important issue. When we elect our president, there's a lot on the table. To go back to the Elmo meme, the world seems like it's at an inflection point, at a crisis point. We need a good leader to solve it. Scholars debate whether the world has now shifted to become more multipolar. What's meant by that is that a pole is a very important power in international relations. Typically, most people will say, or call it a superpower. And so if we think during the Cold War, it was what's known as a bipolar era. The United States on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. It was two big poles in world affairs. Then when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, it left the United States as the sole big player on the planet. It's not to say others didn't have power, but the United States was the unipolar power. More and more authoritarian leaders like Xi in China, Putin in Russia, are trying to push this more multipolar world. We're seeing it to some degree economically with the rise of China, but certainly that's a part of the overall debate. And so, where are we in history, especially as it relates to foreign relations and foreign policy? What's built in that's good, the reality, and what is dangerous, the Elmo on fire? And so if we take a bit of a history lesson and we go back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, you can think of Battle of Waterloo, you can think of Napoleon being defeated by the Seventh Coalition, and what came out of that was the Congress of Vienna, basically a meeting in what is now the Austrian capital to try and figure out, how do we stop another Napoleon rising? How do we get to a point where we can stop these very powerful leaders that just try and take over everything like a big game of Risk? Because if that happens, it's dangerous for things like freedom and liberty and economic growth and free markets. And so the concert of Europe was set up by four original powers: Russia, Prussia, Austria, and the United Kingdom. France later joined it to become the Quintuple Alliance. And for around a century, the countries of Europe, and remember they had colonies all over the world at the time, they largely managed to avoid another Napoleonic Wars. There was the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. Russia and the Ottoman Empire went to war on four occasions during the 19th century, but by and large, they avoided another Napoleon. And the idea was that they could balance each other out. If one country's rising, we're going to balance it there. And so by the time we get to the 1910s, a lot of people in the world are thinking, we've got this figured out. We've got this peaceful world that we've created. In the world in 1913 had significant trade, it had significant travel, it had been peaceful for a long time, the Industrial Revolution was going very well, the middle class was expanding, there were all these wonderful things, and then World War I, the Great War, a cataclysm. And in many ways, the foundations of World War I were not solved by the Treaty of Versailles. And so we have this 20-year, two-decade interim period, and then another worse war. And so for many people, from the first half of the 20th century, the thought was, how do we create a world where we can avoid World War III? How do we stop the next big war, potentially with nuclear weapons? And thankfully, this is where your generations came in and did an awful lot of good. It really is remarkable, the world that was built. Think about it. We have avoided a world war. We've avoided a nuclear exchange since 1945. And I imagine many people in this room played a role in some way, shape, or form in our military, or connected to it, or in the private sector. And so as someone that's enjoying the dividend of all of that, thank you. It really is remarkable. But that's the challenge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it's unraveling a little bit of this structure that was put in place. And so the Cold War period, not to say any of it was easy, not to say that it was all glorious. There were some major conflicts from Korea to Vietnam. Major challenges, but we avoided the large-scale conflict. And then when the Berlin Wall fell, I like to tell my students, it's like the reverse of the COVID year. In 2020, it was like bad news every day. What else is going to happen on the evening news? 1989 was like the reverse of that. This country's democratizing, and this one's gotten rid of communism, and now this is happening. There was a lot that was really, really very good. And then we entered this post-Cold War era where the United States was the most powerful player. Again, it's not to say everything was easy. There were horrific genocides in places like Rwanda and East Timor, brutal civil wars in places like Syria. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, we've seen something new, something different, something challenging the world order. And so the good news is we still live under this post-1945 framework. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, served in the United States Marine Corps, was part of some of the most brutal fighting in places like Peleliu and Okinawa. You know, it's in some ways when I think back as an 18-year-old going over, like, how did you ever get through this? You know, what was required for it? 2 Purple Hearts. I think of my maternal granny. She was part of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the same service that Queen Elizabeth II ended up serving in. My granny was in it through the duration of the war. And this required nursing, trying to help people when London was being bombed in the Blitz, very, very heavily. As a boy, my granny would regale me with stories about how she fell asleep standing up in a bunker because London was so heavily bombed. She lost her front teeth just in, bricks falling. And so out of the midst of all of that tragedy of World War II, some estimates suggest as high as 75 million people were killed. You know, it's hard to put a number on these things, let alone the people injured. But a lot of people said, what can we do differently? How can we create a new world order that will change things? And some big things were put in place. The United Nations system was created on October the 24th, 1945. With it, we have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in a way to help countries avoid hyperinflation, to give them a way out economically. The creation of trade blocs, what is now the European Union, what is now the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, what is Mercosur, that is the Southern Common Market in South America. And some of these have deep challenges. Some of these have been unfair at times. There are still issues, but the idea being is that if the world is safe for trade, we can all win, we can all get rich. Maybe we can avoid war, especially a World War III with nuclear weapons. I would also argue that the most important piece of this has been the United States military, NATO partners, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because it has made the world difficult for bad actors. And so for those of you that have served our military spouses, military families, it's really remarkable what has happened. It doesn't always feel that way, but wealth has grown and peace has been significant in many places. So thank you. Even if you felt like at the time, hey, I'm just doing this job, I'm not necessarily, what am I doing? What you've done is you've built this framework that we still enjoy today in 2024. But that is the challenge of our moment, because all of this is being deeply contested by a range of authoritarian regimes. And we have major foreign relations issues. You can see on the map, Ukraine, a country about which I was privileged to address you past summer. And we can see that the border, the conflict is still ongoing, unfortunately. I think at the time I mentioned it probably will go on a few more years. Once wars like this internationalize, they tend to last longer. There still is no major end in sight. And so we have in the red areas that Russia has taken, yellow areas that have been taken and Ukraine has won back. But there's still heavy fighting as well. We can also lament what happened to Israel on October the 7th of 2023. 1,200 people senselessly murdered in 22 cities and villages and kibbutzim in the south of Israel. There's obviously a massive history that goes into it, and there's a lot that's needed in terms of context, but there are real dangers here of this boiling over to a lot of different areas. Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that predominantly operates in the south of Lebanon, is increasingly making it likely for that conflict to expand. Let alone the Houthis, and you can't see them on this map, also known as Ansar Allah, a terrorist organization in Yemen that has been firing upon Israel as well. And that doesn't even bring into account Iranian proxies in Iraq firing on American bases and taking on Israelis as well. There is a real danger here of an expansion of this war. It's a dangerous time. And I haven't mentioned significant civil wars in places like Sudan and Ethiopia and Syria and Yemen and Libya, conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. These, by the way, are all in the same neighborhood. There's a real danger to what's happening out there in the world. It hasn't hit the news cycle as much as it should, but there's a real danger right now of Venezuela acting out, a recalcitrant dictator that is threatening to take 2/3 of a neighboring country. The eyes of the world haven't, in my view, been adequately placed on this area because, as I mentioned, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it also opened the door. It invited, in a way, a lot of other dictators to do likewise, to go against the norm of aggressive violence against another country, against the norm of annexing territory. Let's go back to my grandfather in 1945. He was in the Marine Corps, then served a tour in the Navy. The United States was really powerful. The Soviet Union was really powerful. The Soviet Union set up proxies all over Eastern Europe under communism. The United States was powerful enough, we could have taken over half the world. We didn't. We gave it back. And that was the principle. That was the example that was set, that nations should have sovereignty, that they should be able to solve their own politics. And that's what's being reversed. That's why this is a dangerous moment, because it does invite, unfortunately, dictators to do likewise. And I pray that this one never happens, but it is worth keeping in mind. And what is also in the back of a lot of people's minds is this: Taiwan. Whether or not China will then act aggressively to take it. And so these are just a smattering of examples. There are many more as well. How do we take all of this? What's likely to happen in the lead up? Is foreign relations likely to be a key issue? Or is it going to be on the side as it has been elsewhere on other occasions? And so the bad thing is, in the world, we've seen a real increase in interstate war, that is, wars between different countries. Although that's normal in history, I mean, you can read about it in the Old Testament, in the Bible, just one country against another. We, since 1945, have seen a lot less of that, interestingly. Now it's coming back. Eastern Europe, the Middle East, new threats, as I mentioned, in South America, Eastern Europe, numerous civil wars. And in this day and age, they last longer. They have worse weapons. And the real challenge. High levels of undocumented immigration will play into our politics as well. That's been a major point of discussion that is connected to the international. As I mentioned, rising authoritarianism, and then what's happened in Afghanistan with the Taliban taking over control again. For the last 15 or 20 minutes or so, I've painted a pretty bleak picture, and I have to be careful of being Elmo again, right? Because, some kind of level-headed analysis is also useful. Again, we in the United States live in this really blessed situation. We have a lot of advantages, and a lot of the world is still really quite peaceful. A lot of the world is still trading. There's still a lot of win-wins in all of this. The major international institutions still largely work. They still largely benefit people, even though there are challenges. Sometimes it is unfair as well. And what's going to be interesting to watch this year in particular is the state of the economy. Because I mentioned, as you saw from the Pew Research, the economy, jobs, it's almost always number one. It's likely to be so again, but it can have a big impact on a president depending on how it's doing. And this economy, I should say, is really quite strange right now. On the one hand, we've had massive inflation in the United States we haven't seen for 40 years. But the stock market did decently, maybe not great last year in 2023, but it was decent. Unemployment remains really, really low in terms of how we measure it. And the economy has grown faster than a lot of the countries in Europe as well. To go back to one of the earlier slides, the sheer size and magnitude of the American economy is remarkable. And so to go back to my initial question, will foreign relations be the key to this election, or will it be a side issue? It's hard to say based on this. But I'll leave you with a few concluding thoughts, and I'll love to hear your questions in a little bit. I'll wrap it up as promised. And so, in my view, foreign relations may not be the singular key to this election like it was in, say, 1980, or to some degree in 2004. But it probably will be a top two issue because of what's happening with Russia and because of what's happening in the Middle East. Much depends on the state of the world. A lot can change between now and November. You've got numerous other speakers coming in, numerous other topics, but it doesn't look like things are going to change with Russia and Ukraine. Israel is still going to have to fight for some time as well, and that is a real challenge. And so what I'll say in conclusion as a final one is that outside of a time of war, foreign policy, foreign relations could play the most significant role since 1980 in this forthcoming election. I guess we'll see. Maybe when November rolls around and foreign policy is nowhere on the map, you can kind of go, doer was wrong. But I guess we'll wait and see with that. So I want to thank you all for your time. I'll spend a good amount of time taking questions. I love the questions from this audience. Really, really remarkable. So thank you.
We'll just lay him right here.
Oh, sure. Thank you. So do you think President Biden physically is fit and capable to run for re-election as president, and why? Nothing like a hot potato right now to start off the bat, but I've never been one to punt, so let's go straight for it. Politics, I think, among my generation and younger, there is a real fear of a lot of different candidates being physically fit, ready, able. It's not to say someone in his or her 70s, 80s could not do it, but our current leaders probably not. And with President Biden, there are significant challenges. My father-in-law is a neurologist, career neurologist. There are certainly some challenges that he's seen professionally there. At the same time, it is worth noting that he still travels, he still does a lot, but I think a lot of Americans are lamenting just the energy level, wanting something more. But we also see that with, say, a Speaker of the House, in the Senate, and I think there is a real desire for a generational change. And so I wouldn't put President Biden uniquely there, but I think there's that desire among many. Please comment on a possible third party versus our two-party system. I've lived in both the United Kingdom and Canada, and there are pros and cons to this. Thank you. And in this election cycle, it is possible. There is a group working to try and put together a joint Democratic and Republican ticket. Joe Manchin from West Virginia would likely be the lead on this ticket. I could plausibly see some traction on it. What I will say in my studies of American politics is that third-party candidates don't tend to go a long way. And so my guess is it's possible, but I don't see it winning as well. This question pertains to presidential polling. I think it's a little off from what I've seen, but be happy to discuss it. One of the reasons why I think President Trump lost in 2020 was that his approval rating hit the upper 30s, lower 40s, and kind of stayed there. Anytime that happens in US politics, it's really bad for the incumbent, just practically speaking. President Biden is in the same neighborhood now. And so it could be fascinating if it's a Trump-Biden matchup again. Both have had that polling numbers that are difficult. Who ends up winning? That will be kind of interesting to see. Briefly, why does Russia want to control Ukraine? I gave about an hour talk on this. It's hard to succinctly say, but the quickest part is that what is today Russia started as Kievan Rus, that is the Ukrainian capital, in the 800s, over 1,200 years, around 1,200 years ago. And even though the capital is now in Moscow and the center of Russia is elsewhere, there's a big sentiment in the Russian mentality that Ukraine is connected to it. Of course, it ignores that Ukraine has been sovereign for 30 years, that there is a Ukrainian nationalism built on farmers and factories and a language and a culture, but Putin ignores a lot of that. There's a lot of history to it. It's a very complex question, but that is part of it. My other view is that Russia has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and what it's trying to do is make up for that. So taking over another country boosts it. And that is very, very scary as a prospect going forward. The next question, can you speak to the key aspects of foreign policy and its relation to national security today? The two are very, very intertwined. In some ways, again, because of our great position internationally, we can sometimes get away with not the best of foreign policy or not watching everything. It doesn't always impact national security. But as I kind of put in on the slides here a little bit, the undocumented immigration issue is, I think, a very scary one for many. We're seeing more people coming in without documentation that we haven't seen since the 1990s. And so, what will happen there? Thankfully, and heaven forbid, there hasn't We will never see another 9/11, but it's one of those things that is very dangerous in this world in which we live. In regards to the selection of a president, do you think our country is shooting itself in the foot with partisanship, thereby not necessarily choosing our best person for the job of president? It's a great question. It's difficult to rise above partisanship. It often breaks down into one side or another rather than someone that is very, very good for the position. But I also think about the comparison of our system versus authoritarian systems, and often how installation of leaders works, or a primogeniture system. And even in our flawed system, we still end up with candidates that have just amazing life experience. It's not always what we'd prefer. Sometimes there's an appeal to a base in a way that we wouldn't like. Maybe we love it, on the other hand, but it can. Partisanship is certainly a scary one, but American institutions have been very enduring as well. Next question is, do you think China is a real threat to the United States? And if we go back to the discussion of unipolar and bipolar and multipolar, the answer is yes. Undoubtedly, China is the number one concern, really the number 1, 2, and 3 concerns. We have to be careful, even though countries like North Korea and Iran could be very dangerous, and the possession of nuclear weapons in the case with North Korea was particularly an issue. But even Russia is far, far weaker than China. China has a very, very strong economy. It's got a massive military. But I also think there are some differences between now and the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were very, very separate entities during that era. We're deeply intertwined with China. The chances of a conflict are real, but it's a challenging calculation for China if they were to ever take us on, because we buy so much of their products. So absolutely, it's a real threat, but it is a challenge. What do you think of America First policy? As long as America First doesn't mean America alone, okay. You have to be careful with it, because it can be challenging, and it can also discourage allies from connecting with you. But there's nothing wrong with prioritizing American jobs, standing up for Americans. These can be good things, but it depends on how it's delivered. And like I said, as long as it's not America alone, everyone needs friends. Everyone needs to connect. Everyone needs that component to it. And I go back to the world of my grandparents in 1945. Americans were so generous with the world. It's really remarkable to win a war like that and just to say, here you go, have your countries back. Even today, there are American flags in parts of France and Belgium and other countries that I've seen. It really is amazing. So that American generosity, if it goes with America First, okay. How might Iran's achievement of the nuclear bomb impact world affairs? How should the U.S. respond? This is where it gets prickly, because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, is a big divider between Democrats and Republicans. President Obama signed it. Most Republicans were opposed to it. President Trump withdrew from it. And so from a Democratic perspective, the JCPOA keeps Iran in a box, but it kind of kicks the can down the road. From a Republican perspective, you can't trust the Iranians, especially the current Iranian government. And so it would be a game changer. Nuclear weapons are really difficult to try and figure out, because tests have become so rare. You may remember from earlier in your lives that nuclear tests were just regular. They happened almost daily. But since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996, nuclear tests have been very, very limited. There have only been 6 in this century, all by one country, North Korea. And the challenge is Iran working with North Korea? And so my sense is that Iran doesn't have a bomb. Be careful, but it has friends with them. And so that is a danger, and it would affect world affairs. But there's part of me that thinks that Iran already has connections to countries with nuclear weapons. Yeah, it's a great question, really is. If China invades, takes over Taiwan, how does that affect the election? Great question, because President Biden has been very tough on this question. He has said repeatedly that he stands with the Taiwanese, that he will defend them. What that means is difficult to know. But it also means that maybe there's a much larger conflict that takes place over it. What's fascinating about the timing to me is that from a logical standpoint, if China was going to take over Taiwan, which it is pledged to do under the Chinese Communist Party, Xi wants to do it at some point. But what's interesting time-wise is that wouldn't it have made sense to invade Taiwan when Russia invaded Ukraine? You know, from a logical standpoint, because if the eyes of the world are kind of, this is terrible, you know, China's getting away with it, Russia's getting away with it. So every day that passes, Taiwan's preparing. And so it is becoming harder and harder and harder for China to invade Taiwan. I like to think of Taiwan like picking up a porcupine. Where do you grab the thing, right? You know, you're going to get stuck one way or another. You could smash it. You can kill the porcupine, but then you don't get any of the rare earth minerals. You don't get any of the natural resources in which Taiwan is so rich. And so, yeah, if it were to happen ahead of the election, it would really have a big impact. This is a great question. It'd be hard to know. But there's also part of me that thinks and remembers authoritarian regimes tend to act at times when they know the U.S. is a little more kind of out of sync. And so what do I mean by that? Russia invaded a country in the Caucasus called Georgia in August of 2008. Why did they do it timing-wise? One, it was during the midst of a really contested presidential election between then Senators Obama and McCain. And President Bush was a lame duck. That's just how the system works. And so Russia was able to get away with it because Bush couldn't really do much, and we didn't know if McCain or Obama would be president. The other thing is they did it on the exact same day as the opening of the Olympic Games in Beijing. So any other day, Russia invades a country is first on the newspaper. That day it was second. Beautiful Olympic Games opens in Beijing. Yeah. So there's part of me that thinks, you know, China will be very, very calculating in this. Oh, this is going. Playing Elmo. Michelle Obama said recently that she is frightened that this coming election could be a disaster. I agree, but looking at the election from the other side, this seems to me the most important election since the 1860s. Yeah, I think my colleague, Dr. Smith, talked about that division. And what really, I think, well, there's part of me, if I go back to the reality side of it, says every election cycle, the politicians and the pundits say this is the most important election of our lifetime. I mean, how many times have we heard that? However, when generations that have experienced and seen a lot of elections write me things like this, I take it seriously. This is a key election. There's no two ways about it. I'm careful in saying it's the most important of our lifetime, but it certainly is going to be very, very high stakes. Absolutely. I take that very importantly. In the run-up to the election, please comment on the medium-term prospects for NATO. Great question. In what context of alliance concerns about former President Trump's destabilizing criticisms and Russian resource advantages vis-a-vis Ukraine, next 5 years or so? Yeah, wonderful question. So NATO has been enduring, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed in 1949 among 12 countries for mutual defense. And under kind of line of that was of democratic countries. 11 of the 12 were democracies. Portugal was the one exception to it. It has now grown to 31 member states and will likely be 32 if Sweden can kind of inch their way in. That's a big question. And so when President Trump, or when candidate Trump ran, he was very, very critical of NATO and a number of the countries, and in some ways rightly so, because at the time there were 28 member states, but only 4 of them actually lived up to their obligations under the 1949 Washington/North Atlantic Treaty. At the same time, the tone was bad. The tone to the allies in Europe was kind of like, hey, you know, we've done an awful lot for NATO as well. Why are we being castigated? It's a time of peace. But I don't think President Trump was entirely wrong. And thankfully now, 10 of the, what is now 31 countries do pay the requisite 2% of their GDP to the military, and a number have pledged to do more. I do think that NATO will endure. It does have a new headquarters in Brussels. I've been by it, so they're putting money into it. And even though there are concerns in parts of Europe, Europe's been interesting. It's been, even though it's come together under the European Union, it's been pretty divided on this issue of the military. What's underreported in the United States is how President Trump, President Bush are really very, very well liked in Eastern Europe, but disliked in Western Europe. And Presidents Obama, Biden, Clinton are loved in Western Europe, but disliked in Eastern Europe. It's kind of this fascinating dynamic. And so I think NATO will muddle through all of it. But I do believe that countries should live up to their obligations. 2% military spending of GDP on the military, and of that, 60% of those funds should be to new equipment. I think a lot of European countries are waking up with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and so that's a big one. Do you think the African continent countries will begin playing much greater parts on the world stage in the next decade? Fascinating question. Nigerian banking has become a real kind of hub and pass through, especially Lagos. So there is the potential. South Africa already plays a very significant role. If Nigeria's population keeps growing the way it's projected, it will be larger than China by the year 2100. Which, by the way, we're projecting upon people that aren't yet born. But if you follow it through in terms of birth rates and the way China is shrinking, Nigeria will pass 900 million by the year 2100. So my initial thought to the question is no, not immediately, because the question does say in this decade, but in the forthcoming decades, it could grow, and it's hard to project out that far. Fascinating question. Thank you.